Hi, I'm Robert Osborne. All month we've been examining how Latinos have been portrayed in Hollywood films, part of a TCM series we call Race in Hollywood. Well, for this final Thursday in May, we're going to wrap up our retrospective with some films involving families. And with me to give his perspective on these movies is the man who helped program this festival, UCLA professor and author of this very informative book called Shot in America, Television, the State, and the Rise of Chicano Cinema. Welcome, Chon Noriega.
Thank you, Robert. It's great to be back.
Good to have you here. Well, first up is a Western from 1983, and it's called The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez. Now, talk about this film, where it fits in history.
It's an interesting film. It's also produced by Moctezuma Esparza, who had been developing it since the late 1970s. And it's one of the few Hollywood films I can think of that's based on an academic book. It's based on Américo Paredes' 1958 study called With His Pistol in His Hand, A Border Ballad and Its Hero. And it's essentially a study of the Ballad of Gregorio Cortez, which is a corrido or a border ballad that chronicles real-life events in South Texas in 1901.
And who was Cortez?
He was a rancher and was caught up in a gunfight with a sheriff due to a mistranslation by one of the deputies alongside of the sheriff. And this then led to the sheriff being killed and his Gregorio Cortez's brother being fatally wounded, and then led to the largest manhunt in Texas Ranger history. And this film chronicles that misunderstanding, the hunt, and then the eventual surrender and trial of Gregorio Cortez.
So he's kind of a legendary hero who was based in fact.
Absolutely. You know? And what's interesting about the film is that it's a revision of the Western in a very distinct way. It's at once telling a typical Western story. It's a manhunt by the Texas Rangers. But on the other hand, it's also telling a corrido. It's telling a ballad which is giving a pretty fact-based, straightforward description of the events that chronicle Mexican resistance in Texas at the turn of the century.
So a little on two levels like The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
Yeah, and it's interesting the way the film sustains it, and one of the first ways it does it is there are no subtitles in the film. So you have to be bilingual really to be following both storylines and both perspectives completely. And I think it works, and I've spoken to a number of people who've seen it that don't speak Spanish, and for them, they don't understand the nature of the mistranslation until the very end of the film when there's the translation scene. And for those who do understand Spanish, they understand right away what's gone wrong, and they see kind of reiterations of that throughout the film, and then they see how it is that the film itself kind of brings that to a resolution. It is one of the classics of American cinema. It's one of the significant revisions of the Western, along with The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And I just think a wonderful film all around. And it's such a smart film in terms of the way it carries this parallel structure between the notion of the Western being revised that Liberty Valance has, where you have a journalist kind of following the action, trying to get what's really going on, and on the other hand, how the Mexican-American community itself is telling the story and communicating it amongst themselves through song. And what's interesting, at the very end of the film, you'll hear Américo Paredes himself singing the Ballad of Gregorio Cortez.
Interesting. You set it up very well. Here's the film from 1983, The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez. Well, back with me to talk about this film is Chon Noriega, an author and professor who is also an expert on the subject of Latino images in films. Interesting how this film does work without subtitles.
Yeah, you certainly can understand the story. You come to realize that you've misunderstood certain transactions. But it's amazing how calculated the film is in terms of using Spanish without subtitles. One of the first scenes where Gregorio Cortez confronts the Texas Rangers that are chasing him. He sneaks up behind one of them and jumps onto his horse and throws him to the ground. Has his gun and looks down at him. The camera's at a low angle looking up at Gregorio Cortez. And he says, "No fue mi culpa," and he rides off. And the next moment, another ranger comes up and picks up the fallen ranger, and he says, "You're lucky he didn't kill you." So if you don't understand Spanish, you think, that's what he said. If you understand Spanish, you realize he was saying, it wasn't my fault. And you don't really you don't find that out if you don't speak Spanish until the very end. But visually, the film is, in some sense, guiding you through the conventions of the Western to misunderstand, to not really capture what it is he's trying to say.
Now this character, legendary character itself, other movies made about him?
There are no other movies based on this per se, but Robert Rodriguez in the Spy Kid trilogies names the lead character played by Antonio Banderas. The character's name is Gregorio Cortez. So it's a little nod on his part, yes.
Yeah.
As somebody that went to the University of Texas and probably saw the film with my colleague Charles Ramirez-Berg, but also University of Texas is where Américo Paredes was on the faculty in both English and the anthropology departments. And this book, The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez, would be the founding text for Chicano studies when it emerged in the late 1960s, largely in response to protests for access for Chicanos to higher education. So there's a way in which the film and the book have influenced the new generation of Chicano filmmakers, and they're making little nods to that in their own work.
Interesting. Well, let's move on. The next movie we have in our look at Latino images in film is one John Sayles wrote and directed in 1996 called Lone Star. No relation to a giant-sized Western with the same title made in the 1950s with Clark Gable and Ava Gardner. Our movie stars Chris Christopherson and Elizabeth Pena.